Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brother and sister, welcome back to Islamic Notes channel. Today we will discuss something that has caught the world's attention, a fact that may not be widely known, but is being widely discussed, especially among Muslims. Before we get into the main discussion, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next interesting videos. Let's start the story. This is a true story about a debate that not only questioned, but also changed the lives of the entire church congregation that attended. Inside a large church in the city center, hundreds of congregants gathered. They did not know that that day would be the day that would change their lives forever. A famous pastor invited a religious teacher to discuss Islam and Christianity. What they thought was just an intellectual debate turned out to be the beginning of an extraordinary spiritual journey. Don't miss it. This story is not just an ordinary story, but a story that can open hearts and minds. Watch until the end, because in it there is a valuable lesson that can change our perspective on the truth. Whoever Allah wants to receive guidance, He will surely open His chest to accept Islam. Share this story so that more people can be enlightened. In a busy metropolitan city, there is a magnificent church called the Church of Saint Benedictus. This church is famous as one of the largest centers of spiritual activity in the city. Its congregation comes from various circles, from intellectuals to ordinary people who faithfully attend Mass every week. Among them, there is a famous pastor named Father Michael. He is widely known as a charismatic figure with broad insight into Christian theology. Many admire him for his skill in explaining religious doctrine in a logical and systematic way. However, Father Michael also has one strong belief. He wants to prove that Christian teachings are the only absolute truth. One day, in a closed meeting with other church leaders, Father Michael proposed a rather surprising idea. "What if we invite a cleric to have a discussion in this church?" he said with full confidence. Several church leaders looked surprised. One of them, Father Samuel, frowned. "You mean a debate? For what? Wouldn't that just make our congregation doubt?" Father Michael smiled slightly. "This is an opportunity for us to show that our beliefs are more correct. If we can prove the weaknesses of Islamic teachings in front of the congregation, then their faith will be stronger." After a long discussion, the church leaders finally agreed. An official invitation was sent to a cleric who is widely known in the world of preaching, Ustaz Abdullah, a knowledgeable, polite preacher known for his calm yet meaningful way of delivering the message. When he received the invitation, Ustaz Abdullah smiled. He knew that this was not just an intellectual debate. This was an opportunity to convey the truth in a good and wise way. With sincere intentions, he accepted the invitation. The long-awaited day was getting closer. The church congregation was waiting with great enthusiasm. For them, this was not just a discussion, but a battle of beliefs between two major religions in the world. News of the open debate at St. Benedict's Church had spread widely. The church congregation and many people from various backgrounds were waiting with enthusiasm. They wanted to see how the debate between Father Michael and Ustaz Abdullah would go. On the other hand, Ustaz Abdullah prepared himself with full calm. For him, this was not an event to seek victory, but rather an opportunity to convey the truth of Islam with wisdom and gentleness. He spent time reading the Quran, studying the books of interpretation, and studying the Bible so that he could have a dialogue with full understanding. In his simple house, one of his students asked, "Ustaz, aren't you worried? They must have prepared many arguments to bring down Islam." Ustaz Abdullah smiled. "We don't argue to win. We have a dialogue to convey the truth. If their hearts are open, it is because Allah has given them guidance." Ustaz Abdullah nodded, then answered softly, "David, I understand your concerns very well. The concept of atonement is indeed the core teaching of Christianity. However, let's see how Islam views salvation. In Islam, salvation is not something that is given because of the sacrifice of others, but because of the grace of Allah and one's own good deeds." He paused for a moment, looking at the congregation one by one. In Islam, God is all-forgiving. He does not burden anyone with the sins of others. In the Quran, Surah Al-An'am, verse 164, God says, "And no soul bears the burden of another." This means that each individual is responsible for his own deeds. David looked pensive, as did many of the other members of the congregation. Some even began to shed tears. touched by the serenity of the explanation. In Islam, Ustaz Abdullah continued, salvation is based on faith in God, good deeds, and recognition of the prophets, including Prophet Isa or Jesus, as God's messengers, not God himself. Jesus is honored, glorified, but not to be worshipped. Another member of the congregation, a middle-aged man, slowly raised his hand. So, you mean we don't need Jesus' sacrifice to be forgiven by God? That's not it, Ustaz Abdullah replied softly. What I mean is, a God who is all-loving and all-merciful does not need to crucify one holy soul to forgive another. He simply says, I forgive, and forgiveness is granted. The atmosphere of the room completely changed. The congregation, who had initially come to watch a debate, now seemed to be following a soul-soothing sermon. Pastor Michael himself remained silent. Ustaz Abdullah's words were too profound to be refuted with ordinary debate logic. David lowered his head, then said softly, I don't know what to do, but for the first time, I feel like I understand God more deeply. Ustaz Abdullah smiled, looking at David lovingly. That's because you use your heart, David, and the truth can always be felt by a heart that sincerely seeks it. With a silent and emotional atmosphere, Ustaz Abdullah walked slowly toward the podium, then looked at the entire congregation. Brothers and sisters, he said, I did not come to invite you to hate, let alone insult the beliefs that you have long embraced. I came to have a dialogue so that all of us, including me, can understand each other and get closer to God in the most honest and upright way. He took a deep breath for a moment. You should know that in Islam, the Prophet Isa or Jesus is one of the most noble prophets. We love him as we love the Prophet Muhammad, but we do not associate anyone with God. Allah is one. He has no children and was not begotten. David still lowered his head, his tears flowing slowly. Pastor Michael looked restless, as if he wanted to interrupt, but didn't know what to say. He knew that Ustaz Abdullah's words were not attacking, but rather touching something deeper. Nature. Then an elderly woman stood up from the middle row of seats. Her voice trembled as she said, I have been sitting in this church for 40 years, but today, for the first time, I feel God is truly close, without intermediaries, without confusion, just me and him. A soft roar of Allahu Akbar was heard from several Muslim attendees. Ustaz Abdullah's eyes were red. He didn't expect his simple preaching to be so deeply moving. Ustaz Abdullah continued, Islam does not force. Even the Messenger of Allah was ordered by Allah not to force anyone to convert to Islam. Our job is only to convey. The rest is between you and God. Slowly, several of the congregation stood up, one by one. Some cried, some smiled with emotion, some stepped forward, hugging the Muslims present. That day, the church that was once filled with the doctrine of the divinity of Jesus felt filled with the light of recognition of the true oneness of God. David stood up. With a firm voice, he said, If the God you worship is the one God, who does not need an intermediary to forgive, then today I bear witness. The atmosphere became very quiet. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. Tears broke out, not because of loss, but because of victory, the victory of the heart over confusion, the victory of light over the darkness of doubt. That day, inside the old church building, an Islamic light shone on souls who sincerely sought the truth. David was still standing. His whole body seemed to be shaken by an invisible force. The congregation looked at him in deep silence. Among those gazes there was confusion, astonishment, and even fear. However, in David, what shines through is sincerity, the sincerity of a seeker of truth. Ustaz Abdullah looked at him gently, then answered in a calm but moving voice, David, salvation is the right of every human being who sincerely seeks the truth and believes in him. In Islam, Allah says in the Quran, Indeed, those who believe, the Jews, the Christians, and the Shabian, whoever among them truly believes in Allah and the last day and does good deeds, they will have a reward with their Lord. There is no worry for them, and nor will they grieve. Qs al-Baqarah 62. He paused for a moment, letting the verse sink into the hearts of the congregation. Salvation does not belong to just one group. It is a gift for anyone who accepts Allah and follows His guidance. The Prophet Muhammad did not come to cancel the teachings of previous prophets, but to perfect them. He is the seal of the prophets, not their erasure. In Islamic teachings, Jesus, or Isa al-Masih, was a noble prophet, born of a holy virgin, and given many miracles. We love him, but we do not worship him. For the only one worthy of worship is Allah, the Lord of all prophets. David shed tears. He couldn't suppress the turmoil in his chest. Everything that had been bothering him was slowly finding answers. Not because he wanted to argue, but because his heart longed for honesty. In front of him now, he is not just an ustaz, but a mirror of sincerity and wisdom. Then, David said in a trembling voice, "What should I do if I want to accept the truth?" Echoes of whispers were heard again among the congregation. Some shrieked softly in disbelief. Father Michael looked at David with unreadable eyes. There was hurt, there was pain, but also respect for the young man's courage. Ustaz Abdullah stepped closer. "David, the truth is not mine, not anyone's. It belongs to God. If your heart is truly open, then say the 2 sentences of the Shahada with conviction, not because of debate, but because you now see the light yourself." David lowered his head, then lifted his face. "Teach me," he said softly. Ustaz Abdullah nodded, and in the middle of the magnificent church room, beneath the cross and old paintings depicting the history of Christianity, a young man said the 2 sentences of the Shahada. "I bear witness that there is no God but God, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of God." Tears flowed from David's eyes. His hands shook, but his soul felt light. In the silence of the church, some of the congregation wept, not because of anger, but because they witnessed something extraordinary, an honesty of heart that no one could force. Pastor Michael looked at David with eyes that were now wet. He said nothing, but in his heart there was a feeling he had never known before. Doubt about the faith he had so steadfastly defended. But that night, in the church that should have been a place to strengthen the old faith, new seeds actually emerged in the hearts of many of the congregation. Seeds that might one day grow into trees of new faith, with roots planted not from inheritance, but from honest searching. And that night was remembered not as a night of defeat or victory, but a night where light greeted hearts that were ready to receive it. The night did not end immediately. The congregation was silent for a long time, even after David finished the Shahada. No one clapped, no one cheered, but the air felt heavy and full of something difficult to explain: surprise, silence, and awareness. David sat back down, now beside Ustaz Abdullah. His hands were still shaking, but his face was peaceful. He felt like he had just been reborn, not symbolically, but truly, from the darkness of doubt to the light of belief. Pastor Michael finally stood up slowly. All eyes were on him. The middle-aged man, who had led the church for more than 2 decades, now looked tired. But not tired from defeat, but tired from the burden he carried in his heart. He said softly, never imagined this night would end like this. He stared at David for a long time. You have made a decision, and I respect it. Maybe this is a calling that your heart cannot delay any longer. But know this, David, you are not betraying us. You are being honest with yourself. Some people cried silently. Others began to leave the pews, leaving with their heads bowed. But there were also those who approached David, shaking his hand, not with anger, but with respect. And that night was the beginning of something bigger. The following days in the small town changed. The news of David converting to Islam spread widely. Many were shocked. Some rejected it, some were cynical, but not a few secretly began to find out. The church began to be attended by fewer people each week. Some faces who used to attend every Sunday began to disappear. Meanwhile, the small mosque on the outskirts of town, which had once been a stopover for a handful of immigrants and local Muslims, was now slowly becoming crowded. David not only studied, but also became a witness. He sat in a small halakha, memorizing the Quran and reading the prophetic biography with with a passion he had never felt before when studying church doctrine. One afternoon after the Asr prayer, David sat with Ustaz Abdullah in the mosque's foyer. "Ustaz," he said, "do you think all this will bring about change?" Ustaz Abdullah smiled, looking into David's eyes that were now full of conviction. Change always begins with an open heart. Like water dripping on a stone, it may not look big today, but one day it will form a deep dent. David nodded. He knew this path would not be easy. There would be ridicule, challenges, maybe even betrayal from those closest to him. But he also knew that the truth was not always greeted with applause. Sometimes the truth only requires one thing: the courage to accept it, even if it means going against the current. And from that courage, change was born. Several weeks have passed since that unforgettable night. David is now known not only as a former youth leader of the church, but also as a new brother who brings a breath of fresh air to the Muslim community in the city. In the mosque, he began to actively preach, not with harsh rhetoric, but with stories. Stories of his search, his questions, and the answers he found in Islam. But on the other side of town, behind the large glass windows of the church that was starting to become quiet, Father Michael sat alone, staring at the altar that had been the center of his faith. He felt strange, not in that place, but in himself. Every time he opened the Bible, his mind began to wander, not because of doubt, but because the voices of questions that he had previously rejected were now slowly growing from within him. The night David said the Shahada continued to play in his mind, not as a defeat, but as a calling. He began to read the Quran in secret, at first because he wanted to know what made David so sure. But the more he read, his heart began to tremble. The verses, which he had once considered as external writings, now felt very personal, as if they were speaking directly to him. This was truly a warning to anyone with a heart. One night he sat in the church library. In front of him were two books, the Bible and the Quran. The window was slightly open, and the night breeze brought in the scent of wet earth and frangipani flowers from the church garden. He was silent for a long time. Then in a low voice he prayed, no longer with the formula he usually memorized, but with the voice of his own heart. God, if you really hear, show me your straight path, not because of position, not because of title, not because of fear, but because I want to know who you really are. Tears fell. That was the first night in his life that he felt really talking to God. At the mosque, David felt something he had not expected. More and more unfamiliar faces came, not just immigrants or converts from the working class, but faces he knew from church. Some came quietly, watching from behind. Some just sat for a while, then left. But David knew this was no coincidence. One of them was Sarah, a former ministry colleague who had been very close to him. "David," she said after Maghrib prayers, her voice nervous, "I'm not ready yet, but I'm starting to feel like there's something I have to dig into." David just smiled. He didn't force, he just invited, because he knew that guidance is not something that can be forced. It is a light that only comes when the heart is ready to receive it. Meanwhile, Pastor Michael began to face pressure. The central church leadership began to suspect his changing attitude. His sermons were no longer passionate, he was quieter. And what worried them most, he no longer spoke badly about Islam like he used to. "Michael," said one of his colleagues, "don't tell me you're starting to believe." Pastor Michael just sighed. "I don't believe yet, but I am searching. Is that wrong?" No answer. And there in the space between the old faith and the new, the true journey began. Light behind the shadows. That night, rain fell slowly, wetting the city streets. Behind the curtains of his office, Father Michael stared at the sky. In his left hand, a small English Quran lay open on a page he had read many times, Surah Maryam. He read slowly, verse by verse, about Jesus, about his mother, about the mission of the prophets. His heart throbbed every time he read Jesus' name with such reverence, not as God, but as a glorified servant. Suddenly, it was as if the whole puzzle in his mind came together. Jesus was not God. He was a messenger, like Moses, like Abraham, like Muhammad. Michael closed the book. He leaned back in his chair, then bowed his head deeply. His heart pounded. There was no sound except the ticking of the clock on the wall. He knew this wasn't just about faith. This was about his whole life, about what he would leave behind and who he would turn to. The next day, he didn't preach. The congregation sat waiting, confused by the empty pulpit. Finally, a substitute pastor stepped forward and delivered a bland sermon. Meanwhile, Michael went to a place that only he and God knew, a small park behind the church. There he prayed for the last time in his old way. Then with light steps, he walked to the mosque in the city center. David was sitting on the porch of the mosque, giving a short sermon to two young men. Suddenly, someone stood at the fence. Formal attire, long coat. His face was familiar. David stood up. Their eyes met. "Father Michael." "No longer a priest," he answered with a calm smile. There was a moment of silence. There were no words enough to explain such a moment. "I want to learn from the beginning," he continued, "not because I lost, but because I have seen the light and I can no longer refuse it." David's eyes filled with tears. He invited Michael in. Inside the small room of the mosque, they sat together. And for the first time, the former church leader recited a sentence that he had once considered foreign. "Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah." The mosque was silent. Then the echo of takbir rang out from those who witnessed the rare moment. The news spread. The church was in an uproar. Some were angry, many were stunned, but not a few were curious and began to ask questions. In silence, a movement was born, not from debate, not from criticism, but from the honesty of a seeker. And that night, in a small mosque that used to be crowded only on Fridays, the light of faith lit up in the heart of a man who had once devoted his life to the old faith. But now he had found the truth, and his new adventure had just begun. Unstoppable wave, the majestic saint. Gabriel Church looked calm from the outside, but inside the roar of debate was heating up. The elders sat around a long, old wooden table, their faces tense. Father Michael's resignation letter lay in the middle of the table, handwritten in neat black ink. It was brief but profound. "I choose the truth. I choose Islam. I do not want to hate. I do not want to invite war. But I can no longer live in the shadow of a belief that I no longer believe is pure." The elders looked at each other. Some were angry, some were confused. But one thing they could not ignore. Since Michael's departure, the congregation had been slowly shrinking. Not just because of his departure, but because of the final messages he left behind. Some of the congregation began to ask deeper questions, to dig more critically, especially when one of the young people who often attended Michael's study forums at church, Rachel, a theology student, began to show drastic changes. Rachel sat in her university library. In front of her, two large books were open. One, a commentary on the Bible, one, an interpretation of the Quran. For a week, he had slept no more than 2 hours a night. Michael's thoughts kept ringing in his head. At first, he wanted to deny it, but the more he read, the more his heart trembled. Could it be that we had been wrong all this time? He sent a message to David with one sentence. "Can I ask you a question from the heart?" Meanwhile, Michael lived in silence. He lived in a small house near the mosque, far from the luxury of the church. No more followers, no more standing ovations. But there was something he had now: peace. Every day, one or two people came. Some just asked. Some challenged him to a debate. Some cried because they were touched by his story. And among them, there were former drunkards, there were drug dealers who repented. There was even a young priest who came without his robe, sitting for hours on Michael's porch, just to hear the story of his journey of faith from the mouth of someone who had experienced it himself. That Friday, the mosque was packed, not only by Muslims, but also by curious church guests. David stepped up to the pulpit, his voice heavy but gentle. Today, we are not talking about differences. Today, we are talking about searching, about the courage to leave something that is comfortable in order to find something more true. He looked at Michael, who was sitting in the first row. The man lowered his head, his eyes moist. Our brother Michael never forced. He only searched. And in his search, he inspired us to ask, have we truly known the Islam that we believe in? Or have we only inherited it without ever loving it? The mosque was silent. Then a small cry was heard from the back bench. Rachel, the church girl, covered her face with the hijab she had just worn that day. Not long after, she stepped forward, trembling, and said in a soft voice, I also want to take the Shahada. And the wave broke. Not a tsunami of destruction, but a wave of guidance that continued to spread. From one heart to another, from one shaking church to one increasingly vibrant Muslim community. And in the midst of it all, Michael stands still, not as a hero, not as a prophet, but as a servant, once lost, then finding his way home. Between the sea of sand and the endless sky, Mecca, the hot air burned his skin, but Michael's soul was covered with a coolness that could not be described in words. He stood in the middle of millions of people, all wearing the same white cloth. No position, no title, no microphone or altar, just humans and their God. His tears broke out when he first laid eyes on the Kaaba. This is what I have been calling from a distance, he murmured softly. What I called a stray without ever knowing it. But now I am here, O Allah. Your servant has come. At night in Mina, after throwing the devil, Michael sat alone. He opened his small journal, now worn out by tears and ink. He wrote, I used to stand on a high altar looking at humans from the pulpit. Now I prostrate myself on the ground, level with the sand, level with the ants, level with other creations. But I have never felt this close to the sky. He closed his journal. Then he stood up, looked up, and prayed. No longer in the rhetorical style of a priest, but softly, brokenly, with a new language of love. O Allah, if this is the end of my life, then end it in Islam. But if there is still your time that you lend me, make this life a torch for hearts that are still dark. I don't want to be anyone. I just want to show that you truly live in that light. When he returned to his country, Michael was no longer a sensational figure. The media spotlight had shifted to other political issues, but one by one, people kept coming. They weren't looking for a motivator. They were looking for a soother. Now his small house on the edge of the mosque is a place to study the Quran. Young people from various backgrounds study there. Not only about verses, but about struggle. About how someone who used to reject finally accepts. About how Allah turns hearts as quickly as turning a hand. And every night after everyone had gone home, Michael stood in Qiyam al-Layl, crying and bowing and prostrating himself. One night he said to himself, looking up at the sky, I never lost the church. I never lost the pulpit. I just realized what I thought was light was just a lamp, and now I have found the sun. Epilogue, a letter to the searchers. Several years after his return from the Holy Land, Michael sat on the porch of his small house. His old hands held a worn book, his own work, a book written not with ambition, but with tears. The title was simple, Light from the Edge of Dreams, the story of a pastor who meets his God. He did not write to be famous. He wrote for one person he imagined in this world, a person who felt empty in the midst of the crowd, who longed for God but was afraid to leave everything he had ever believed in. And as it turned out, that one person became 1,000, then tens of thousands, until finally the book was translated into various languages and read in the churches where he had preached. Some read it with anger, some with tears, but most in silence then asked themselves, am I also searching? One night, a young man came knocking on his door. His eyes were swollen. Mr. Michael, I am a pastor, but I read your book, and I have not been able to sleep since. Michael smiled. He was not surprised. He knew this story was not about him. He was just a bridge. What mattered was who walked across the bridge towards the truth. If you are truly seeking, he said, then do not be afraid, because the truth never stands behind a locked door. Towards the end of his life, Michael often wrote short letters, addressed not to a specific person, but to souls who were lost but longing to return home. One of his letters read, "For those of you who are afraid to leave your old habits for the sake of light, remember Prophet Abraham also left his father. Prophet Musa also left the palace. But what they found after that was eternal glory. Do not be afraid of being abandoned by humans. Be afraid of being abandoned by God." Michael died smiling, with ablution, after a long night of tahajjud. There was no cross, there were no bells, but around him there were young people who are now preachers, ustaz, and teachers. They read Al-Fatiha, and one of them said, "He came from a faraway place, but Allah picked him up, and he came home, not only bringing light to himself, but also to a dark world." Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.